Welcome back. The peace process has not lived up to its name. After so many years and so many disappointments, there is no evidence that we are any closer to peace than we were when the peace talks started.
It will be signed by President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin, and it will be witnessed by me.
What we seek is a solution that meets the twin tests of fairness and security.
The children of Abraham, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, have embarked together on a bold journey.
I think all of us have enabled our Palestinian friends make their life happier, wealthier.
But I think that the presence here clearly symbolizes our commitment to end the violence and get the peace process going again.
I called on Israel to respect the rights of Palestinians, including the right to live in dignity in a free and peaceful Palestine. We seek true peace. My vision is two states, living side by side in peace and security. The task begun here at Annapolis will be difficult. This is the beginning of the process, not the end of it.
I'm joined once again in the studio by Karma Nabilsi and Tariq Ramadan, and from New York, head of the Middle East Peace Project, Henry Siegman, and from Beirut, Shafiq al-Hout, former PLO leader and ambassador to Lebanon. Welcome to you all. Henry, the Palestinians and the Israelis over the last 15 years signed 7 peace accords. And look where we are now, nowhere.
Well, at the risk of oversimplifying matters, my view is that it hasn't worked, not because we haven't been clever enough to design a political formula that would bring the parties together, but rather because Israelis have not yet come to understand that they cannot achieve the security that they seek by military means. And if they had invested just a fraction of the energy and resources that they have in their military approach, had they invested this in a diplomatic approach and sought to satisfy and provide a measure of justice and fairness to the Palestinians, their security problems would have been resolved a long time ago.
So in fact, you actually think that putting security first, presumably Israel's justification for all injustices done since 1948, is the reason why the peace process failed?
No, I don't think putting security first is the problem. The problem is thinking that you can deal with security by military means and suppressing the side that is militarily weaker. That has been the major flaw in Israel and in the American approach to the conflict.
Shafiq al-Hout, in Beirut, it did seem for many Palestinians that the peace process was nothing more than war by other means. Why is the Palestinian Authority and leadership still involved in this peace process?
I'm really surprised why. I think the major reason is the fact that Israel is not really ready for peace. They are still obsessed by the Zionist ideology that deny the presence of the Palestinian people. It's not only the ruling class in Israel, even the Israeli society in general is not yet accepting the idea that there were a country called Palestine and there were people called Palestinians, and they are entitled to the same rights like all people in this globe. Even the very few in the Israeli intelligentsia who recognized the presence, the existence of Palestinian people have not yet recognized the rights of these Palestinians. And this is why we found from the very beginning that the Israeli negotiator was not really serious or eager about concluding peace through that round which was carried in Washington. And the second reason is Israel was not ready to pay the price for its existence and the recognition of the Palestinian people in Israel. The price has been accepted by the international community. The inalienable rights of the Palestinian people have been well defined.
Yes.
But apparently, the Israelis are not yet ready to give up any of the usurped land or the usurped rights of the Palestinian people.
Henry, before I come back to the studio, I would like to go back to you and just ask, is America an honest broker in this peace process, or should the diplomatic process be in the hands of someone more credible, perhaps, than the United States?
The United States has never been an honest broker when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And in a sense, it's precisely because it is not an honest broker, which is to say, precisely because the Israelis know they have a genuine friend in any American administration, that it was expected only the United States can restore the balance to a very imbalanced situation, given the preponderance of power enjoyed by Israel in this conflict. It's only when an unquestioned friend like the United States were to say to Israel, now wait a minute, you are really not only not helping your own cause, but you're also creating problems for American interests in the region. You must change your direction. Only from this kind of pressure can a change, of course, be effectuated in Israel. But unfortunately, that minimum amount of pressure that is necessary from the United States in order to bring some kind of balance into this equation was never exercised. No American administration has been prepared to pay that political capital. Certainly the worst of all administrations has been that of President Bush.
Yeah.
So if anything, we have gone backwards rather than forward.
Professor Ramadan, the Arabs came out with historical initiative, and that is giving full normalization and peace and security to Israel in return for withdrawal from occupied territories. Why haven't that worked?
Because I think the answer is we just heard the answer, that we are not talking about a peace process, and we don't have a government, and the successive Israeli governments, they are talking about peace.
So why did the Arab propose it then?
Because I think that for the last decades, what we had coming from the Arab world is to try, and they tried many times, and the Palestinians tried, and we heard even about Hamas, and we heard about all the governments from within. They tried, and they are just trying to show that they are willing to get that peace. On the other side, you have Sharon's cabinet advisors saying, we are gaining time. It's a question of time for us. We are continuing the settlements, and then we are gaining time. So on one side, the recognition of the Palestinian rights, the recognition of the very existence of something which is a Palestinian state is not there.
Well, here we go, Karma. The United States did not work. Israel Palestinians wouldn't get there. The Arab initiative didn't help. And then they established a so-called quartet. Russia, the European Union that Professor Ramadan talks about, the United Nations become junior partner, and the United States. And yet, with the involvement of all four, nothing happened. Where is the so-called international community's role in all of this?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a question that we're all asking ourselves. I think that we've had the opposite of a peace process. I mean, I think what's the largest tragedy of the last 15 years of the international community's activities, if we can call them the international community, is this covering of the conflict and the management of the conflict and the enormous amounts of money and time and energy to not resolve the conflict. The saddest thing is we're still here talking 60 years on after the catastrophe about the core of the conflict has not yet been addressed. We haven't yet had a peace process which actually deals with the issue that Palestinians and Israelis need to deal with.
The core issues.
Yes.
Jerusalem, refugees.
And more important than Jerusalem and refugees, it's what Shafiq al-Hud talked about is the inalienable rights, which is not really about a state and not really about Jerusalem. It's about the core principles of return and self-determination.
Yes.
And I think the one thing I'd like to say about the Israelis not being ready is that the ideology is as important as the military power that they now have, because they feel that they can have that their existence is dependent on the Palestinians disappearing. And that's about what 48 was about. It was about the expulsion of the Palestinians, that they could only exist if we disappear.
Henry, you wrote recently that not only is the peace process not helping, but in fact Israel is using it to create new facts on the ground. So what do you suggest now then? If we end the so-called peace process, what then?
Israeli declarations about their commitment to some ultimate peace agreement. They're signing on to the roadmap, for example, and their support of the quartet. This was not intended, as it was wrongly assumed by the international community, as a move to begin to turn the parties to a path towards agreement, but rather to make it possible for Israel to create the political room for Israel to deepen its presence in the West Bank. This was the Israeli strategy. And unfortunately, it has worked very well because it has created the room for the political daylight for Israel to continue with its settlements policy and to expand in areas which may, in fact, have made a viable Palestinian state impossible today.
Mr. Hout, you heard Henry Siegman. If this is his assessment, then what is the alternative for the Palestinian leadership?
Now we are living the illusions of what they call Mr. Bush vision. I want to remind the whole universe that the Palestinian state exists. It's there by the same resolution which created Israel. I'm referring to the partition resolution 181 in 1947. The same right which the Israelis made use of and created their state is the Palestinians are entitled to use it. All what we need is the evacuation of the Israelis from the occupied territories of what was Palestine once upon a time. That's number one. Number two, when the PLO was established, the West Bank and Gaza Strip were under Arab authorities. The call for the resistance movement at that time, for the liberation movement of that time, is the return of the Palestinian refugees to their homeland and to their properties. And that is the cornerstone